All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 19, Section 3, Relief from the Chaos of Urban Life. So we talked a little bit about the struggle, the life and struggles for the urban working class. This included things like congestion in the cities, crime, pollution, disease, right? There were a lot of problems in the cities. And at this time in the Gilded Age, 1870 to 1900, there was very little avenues in terms of relief for these problems. Most governments were not quite responsive yet to the needs of the public, especially the urban public. But one way that problems did get solved in the cities was through machine politics. And machine politics is kind of the, it's a relationship between the public on one hand and corrupt politicians, right? Corrupt politicians. So you got the public and corrupt politicians. And typically the way that machine politics worked is that typically there was a boss, or quote unquote the boss. The boss was the leader of the machine. And what the leader or what the boss or what the machine would do is that they would offer public support, right? So whatever that was, whether that was to create more police officers, to create a sewage system, to create street cleaning services, the machine would offer some sort of public service. And what the public would give the boss or the machine was their vote. Right? So it was an exchange in votes for an exchange in some sort of public service. Once that boss got elected into office, then they could use their political position in order to enrich themselves, right? This is where the corrupt comes in. So even though it was a system in which bosses enrich themselves through illegal and corrupt activity, through gaffes, a gaffe is a kickback on a public project, it was one of the very few ways that the public or the urban cities ever got any type of support. The most famous of these political machines was the Tammany Hall machine. This was in New York. And the most powerful boss was William Tweed, who was in charge of the Tammany Hall political machine. And so just to give kind of a little bit better of an idea, this is essentially, I'll scroll down to the very bottom here to give kind of an illustration of how this works. So you have the city politics, and the city politics, let's say, we'll put a position governor here. Now that governor is controlled by the machine and the boss, right? By the machine and the boss, right? They influence the governor. Then you have the public over here. And, they're living in a very bad urban situation, right, that needs a lot of attention. Essentially, the public would promise to cast their vote for the machine and the boss. And in return, they would create, let's say, street sweeping. That might be a useful thing. So the public gets street sweeping, which is much needed at this time. However, that street sweeping might cost, for example, the city, we'll say $5 signs, right? And so on the city balance or on the city budget, street sweeping is costing this much money. This is taxpayer dollars being used for street sweeping. However, the gaffe is when you take, let's say, part of that and give it back to the machine or the boss. And so this way the machines and the bosses, people like William Tweed, end up getting more money. So yes, there is $1 of street sweeping helping the public. There's $4 or much more going back to the boss where they can enrich themselves. But for the most part, when it came to the Gilded Age, this was one of the only ways that, a lot of the problems for the public got alleviated. So as corrupt as it was actually to some degree responsive to the needs of the public. And again, Tammany Hall and William Tweed siphoned off, hundreds of millions of dollars as a result of his various corrupt dealings in New York. Now, another way to escape the problems, not necessarily solve the problems, but to escape, was popular culture and entertainment. So this was to escape problems in the cities. Right, escape the problems. Amusement parks. Coney Island was perhaps the most famous amusement park, which again would have various rides and shows, musical performances, talent shows, etc., etc. Vaudeville was a form of theater. It was more like a talent show. And vaudeville performances would travel from city to city and do various performances, magic tricks, juggling, feats of strength, singing, whatever it was entertainment. Films and movies would eventually surpass vaudeville, but only, thanks to inventions. It's really not until post-1900 afterwards that films and movies really replaced the vaudeville theater performances, but this is new groundbreaking technology right around the corner. Both baseball and boxing, these were very popular sports, not just to participate in, but to spectate. In fact, have the creation of the precursors to what is the MLB really formulating at this particular time. The first professional baseball team is created in the Gilded Age in the 1880s, and this was especially baseball and boxing in particular were very much popular among the working class. Now, even though the working class makes up the majority of the people in the city, they do occupy the lowest rung, so to speak, in this class-based system. And that even though there's a lot of leisure and entertainment time available for them, there's much more so for the upper class, which has a completely different culture. So when we mean upper class, we generally mean more wealthy. But it wasn't just wealth and money that separated the upper class from the lower classes or the working classes, but it was also culture. So rather than, baseball, boxing, theater, amusement park, it was more sort of sophisticated versions of entertainment, concerts, classical music. One of the things we talked about previously was the creation of things like Carnegie Hall by Andrew Carnegie, where you could go see concerts and such. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, art museums were a very popular pastime of the upper class. You had publications like the Social Register. This was a publication that kind of spread upper class culture, especially vacation. That was a big kind of marker of an upper class family, was going on vacations. And the Social Register, which was this sort of magazine, would show you the popular vacation spots, and a lot of the upper class would engage in that. Now, while you had the working class at the very bottom of society, the upper class at the very top of society, you did have a new middle class. And the middle class more or less marked themselves as being educated and located in the suburbs. Suburbanization is, right outside the city. So rather than living right in the center, where you have the most problems with crime and congestion and disease, the middle class could afford to live right outside the city, and that usually meant to pay for transportation. So if you could afford to buy a subway ticket every day to go to work, then you could be in part of the middle class. The middle class was also highly educated, so college, and maybe something to mark them different than the working class is they did not perform physical labor, right? They weren't the upper class in that they didn't own like a factory. They weren't part of the investment class, but they didn't perform any physical labor at work. Usually non-physical labor, managerial positions, doctors, lawyers, that sort of class was the mark for the middle class. And this had an effect on men, women, and children. For women, there were many new educational opportunities. Mount Holyoke was a women's college, and you had women's colleges opening up. Mount Holyoke was just one of them, but there were many more that were opening up all across the country. For the middle class themselves, not just the women but also the children, public schooling was more available. The Morrill Acts, these were laws passed by Congress to create new colleges. At the time, it was really only private Ivy League schools that were available, but more and more people were now going to college because it was more affordable. This is one of these agricultural colleges that were created, so more people entering into the educated class. And really middle-class reformers sought to make the cities more beautiful. I mean, the cities were dark, they were polluted, they were called concrete jungles. And so in some places like New York and Boston and other areas, there was a desire to create urban green spaces, to make parks, to create boulevards, which are streets to alleviate, streets to solve congestion. And many of these things were centrally planned. And that was the idea that you could make a city beautiful. It didn't have to be sort of this concrete jungle. You could plant trees, you could plant parks, you could, and this is an example here, you could plan out a city and the streets as such so that it makes sense. You can kind of see how this is sort of organized in that way. And so the middle class certainly had their impact be felt in some of these areas like the City Beautiful movement.